We're in John 15, working our way through. We're actually to verse 2 today. You know, there's so many questions that pop up when you're reading John 15. Today, we're going to look at 3 of the questions. What is cutting? What is pruning? And what is fruit? But first, let's read the verses. I put them up here on the screen since it's a small little passage. Starting with verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper. Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he cuts off. And he prunes every branch that produces fruit so that it will produce more fruit. Now, there's some scary things in there. What is this? Cutting and pruning and so on. But to answer these 3 questions, I'm going to look at the big picture today. And I got 2 big words we need to know in order to answer these questions. One is paradigm, and the other is entropy. Now, we got a lot of wordsmiths in here. People do crossword puzzles and are writers and all this. And you probably already know what these words mean, but for the others, let me define them. Paradigm is sort of like a worldview, but it's much more encompassing and broad and subtle, really. A paradigm means a model for the way things are. We live in a paradigm. We don't realize we live in a paradigm. It's just the way we live and understand the world around us. It's the way we think the world is. And perhaps it is the way the world is. That's a paradigm. Sometimes we hear about a paradigm shift, and this actually helps explain it a little bit better, this cartoon. It's a chick that's just hatched and says, oh, wow, paradigm shift. So it's going from living in the egg to just living in the world. It's disconcerting. We have to adjust everything, our expectations, and adapt our behavior and even the way we think and are wired and our brain shifting. Our paradigm like that is exhausting. And if you've gone overseas or even to New York, you know what you're talking about. Or even for people who are here in rural areas, to go to the city and try to drive, you understand what a paradigm shift is. It's exhausting. Well, today we're going to shift our paradigm. Be ready. Now, entropy. It's a science term. Basically means that it takes energy to keep everything organized, and if there's no energy to do it, things fall apart. It's like your garden. We're all real familiar with this, and in fact, Reba was lamenting all summer about this one, actually. If you don't keep weeding and watering your garden and caring for it, pretty soon you no longer have a garden, you have a vacant lot. And in a closed system like this walled garden, if you get sick and you only have so much energy, or you're doing something else, all these things, you can't deal with your garden. Your energy gets used up, you don't have any energy left, and everything in your garden gets chaotic. That's a closed system, like a walled garden. However, if you have an open system, energy is applied from outside. Like if you're too sick to weed your garden, but you have really friendly neighbors, and they'll do it for you, and they come over and make a wonderful garden out of your place. With all these neighbors around you, have an open system, and the garden stays orderly because they can apply energy to it. So basically, entropy means that things fall apart unless you work to keep them together. And sometimes you need help from outside yourself. Got to hang on to these ideas. Because now we're ready to look at the paradigm of our world. Like gardening, the world works best if someone is controlling entropy. Think of the whole world as a garden. So God started to control entropy back in Genesis 1, 1 and 2, and that's really what Genesis is about in the first chapters. And I love how the Septuagint translates the Hebrew into the Greek. It says, in the beginning God made the heaven and the earth, but the earth was unsightly. Don't you love that? And unfurnished. I'd never heard that before. That's what the Hebrew actually means, I guess. And darkness was over the deep. The idea is like this picture of Europa. This is the moon Europa. It's all covered with frozen water. The earth was a confused wasteland with nothing in it and no point to it, and even the water was black. It was all useless and barren until God did something with it. Instead of a barren, watery rock, the energy God applied to the earth created our beautiful home planet, Earth. And then God told humans to continue his work, applying energy to make the earth a place of meaning and wonder and joy. And we control entropy every time we make something or even go out and pull a weed. You're controlling entropy and obeying God's command. Isn't that cool? That brings us to a very tiny word in verse 2, where Jesus is talking about the world he created. He says, every branch in me. That tiny word in is critical here. What does he mean when Jesus says, in me? Is he talking as God? So then he's referring to the whole earth and everyone on earth as being in him? And by branches, does he mean all the various branches of humanity, of people and nations? Is that what he means? Or is he restricting his meaning to only his personal followers? Is he restricting his meaning only to Christians who are in him? If that's what he means, well, then it raises all kind of questions that are problems for us. Like, how can a Christian be cut off from Jesus and burned up when Jesus says that nothing can do that to his followers? To his sheep. Nothing can take his sheep out of his hands, it says. So how can it mean that? It can't mean that. Because Jesus protects and preserves his own, he says. Like this painting shows. But I think that Jesus is speaking about as God now. I think that's what he's doing. And I think he's including the whole of creation, of nations and people groups, when he says, in me. So, now that night, when Jesus said these words, they had left the Last Supper and were who knows where, walking to the Garden of Gethsemane perhaps. Anyway, it doesn't really matter where they were. But he was on his way to the cross, and he was talking about this particular nation in which they were walking. His nation, Israel. And particularly, he was speaking of the leaders of their religion in the temple. Particular religion. The Jewish religion isn't like it was then. No. And so he's talking about the religion that they had then and the nation as it was at the time. The particular nation, Israel. They thought they were in God. But all through the gospel accounts, we see Jesus trying to bring them back, trying to warn them, and finally, at the end, condemning them. And his prediction happened in 70 AD. The temple was completely destroyed, and Jerusalem was paved over with grass, so that nobody could even tell it had been there, and it was illegal to build another city there. That's what Jesus had predicted. So when Jesus said in me, he's not just talking about Israel, though. He's talking more broadly about anyone who claims to be in God. So, using this grapevine metaphor, he says that if you are in God, then you are branches on the vine of God. And the love of God is the sap in the branches, like this illustration shows. The branches in God must live by the love of God. The branches must believe God loves them and let the love of God flow through them to everyone else. That's what we are created to do. That's what brings order to everything, the love of God working through us. So we have to let the love of God flow through us. Okay, what does cut off mean? Scary word. It means that we're not living in this paradigm of God's love. We're living a natural state of entropy. We are allowing disorder and disease to accumulate. So God cuts off those branches that bring disease and disorder. Talking to Steve at the vineyard, that's what he said they do. They cut off these branches that are going to bring disease to the vine and are useless and dangerous. So like in our garden or a vineyard, diseased limbs and plants are cut off and burn to cleanse a garden from contamination that might spread. It's an act of love for the whole garden, you see. You don't want to have disease. When they had to cull all those chickens this summer because there was a disease spreading. It was a disaster for all those farms, but it was a work of love for the whole industry to kill off this disease. That's what cut off means. It's the same with any group of people. I have 3 of these images. I only used one. This is of Steve, and then I asked Jack to give me an angry man, so he let his hair down. He's like, this is crazy. Anyway, it's the same with any group of people, whether nations or families or organizations or churches. You know what a burning hell it is to be in a group of people who hate each other and fight all the time. We know that, right? It's clear. And such people destroy their organizations. Even a church can't survive when people hate each other. They just blow apart. A person who is full of hate and bitterness is not abiding in the paradigm of God's love. He doesn't know God, and he must be cut off from the vine, lest the whole is disrupted and destroyed and devolves into chaos. Cutting is an act of love for the whole, because it preserves the whole group, the whole nation, the whole organization. And sometimes in an organization you got to fire somebody because they're destroying the group. That's cutting. Which brings us to pruning. Pruning's for a different purpose than cutting. Cutting preserves the garden's purpose, the whole garden's purpose. That's what cutting does. Pruning encourages growth in each branch. It's also an act of love, this time for the branch itself. But it does sound strange, doesn't it, like the title of this sermon? To think of pruning as an act of love, because pruning hurts. That doesn't sound like an act of love. How is pruning an act of love? Well, it takes us back to entropy again. Entropy runs amok in a wild forest. Like a garden without any care, even a valuable grapevine would be like any wild vine in the forest. They're not diseased, but they're out of control and fruitless, and their lives are pointless. On my walks in the woods, I see these wild grapevines going crazy all over the place like this. They climb over the trees and kill the trees. They never, ever see any grapes. It's why aren't there any grapes? Because they're putting all their energy into stems and leaves. They're completely uncontrolled. And they kill the trees. So like a wild grapevine, when we're left to ourselves and just follow our own desires and don't even try to prune ourselves, entropy takes over. We develop all sorts of wild suckers, habits and behaviors and all these things that aren't helpful and may even be destructive. They grow willy-nilly from our natural desires and our natural physical pleasure and all these things and personal pride. They grow crazy like that, and our lives become pointless. If we continue to focus on fulfilling what we want and what our bodies desire, eventually everything falls apart. And entropy can even kill us before our time. Because you just let your body do whatever it wants and you get bigger and bigger and bigger and you get a heart attack and die. Entropy can kill you. We have to be pruned. And that's where pruning comes in. This isn't Steve's vineyard, this is another guy. Pruning is trials and the sufferings we go through. That's what pruning is in our lives. And it hurts. But pruning lets the sap of love flow in a helpful direction. Like this one, he's cutting off a twig that's growing in the wrong direction and will interfere with other twigs. He's cutting it off. I don't suppose if the plant feels anything, it doesn't like that. Through suffering and trials, we become more aware of others who hurt in the same way. Have you noticed that? Our hearts become softened. Our resolve is strengthened. Our faith tested to see if we trust God's love to see us through. We can see for ourselves. That's what pruning does. It makes us more loving and more trusting because we can look back and see what God did with it in our lives. We gain wisdom. We gain endurance. But I have to be honest, sometimes it's a crossroads and some people will become more bitter and fly away and be cut off. So we see that painful pruning is done for a purpose. It redirects the sap away from useless and pointless activity and even destructive behaviors. You've heard of people who've gone through life-threatening experiences, I'm sure. You know now, if you've gone through a life-threatening experience, you know now what's important in life. And you want to do something that's worthwhile with what you have left. It changes your whole paradigm of life when you have a major pruning in your life. If the sap of God's grapevine then is love, what is that fruit that pruning is supposed to encourage? What's the fruit? You've heard fruit of the Spirit, bringing people to Christ. Is that what it is? Well, it's like this. We lived in San Diego, and we moved into the house. There was this peach tree in back. There was just a scraggly old bush. No peaches on it. Lots of twigs. So I whacked that thing and whacked that thing, pruned the thing right back to stubs, and waited. And the next year, my goodness, there was one peach on that thing, and it was huge. Well, maybe not that huge. My goodness, what a peach. We picked that baby and we bit into it. What was our reaction when we tasted that big old sweet peach? It was joy. Unbelievable peach. It even better than these that the Lions would bring from Colorado. It was amazing. Pure, because I'm salivating thinking about that peach. It was pure joy to eat that peach. So like that, joy is the fruit that Jesus is telling us to bear. That's what the fruit is. The fruit of the Spirit in Galatians and bringing people to Christ, those are like the peaches, but the ultimate result is joy. The point of it is joy. That's the fruit. So God's love permeates everything. This is some of Steve's grapes right there. He constantly works to bring order to chaos. And why does he do that? To bring about joy. We sang about it. Even the angels sang for joy when they saw what God had done in creation, it says in Job. Genesis tells us that God created humans to participate in this work of bringing joy to the world. And Christ is enlisting his followers now in the same work, the work of joy. Christians are supposed to bring joy to the world. If you're bringing hate, you're doing it wrong. The good news is joyful news. Even pruning is the work of joy. What a remarkable turnaround for the paradigm of our lives. Did you ever think that the purpose for your life was to bring joy to the world, to your world, to your people? When we grasp the idea that the sap of the branch is the love of God and it's meant to produce the fruit of joy, we enter a whole new paradigm of life with a whole new set of expectations and behaviors. It isn't about condemning people. It's about bringing them joy. We enter a major paradigm shift in our lives. It's a whole new purpose. The love of God surging through us to other people, bringing joy to everyone around us. That's what Jesus intended. So we need to ask ourselves, where do I need pruning? Do my beliefs, my expectations, my behaviors let the love of God flow through me to bring joy to my neighbor in my town? What's getting in the way? I have a friend, Deborah Rodering. She's an artist, lives in Fergus, and she's one of my Facebook friends. And she wrote this and gave me permission to read it to you. As we as people are given the compassion and the energy to help all around us during times of need. We can assist communities during times of illness and epidemics and care for the children who are left behind if the parents die. We can assist young mothers and hard-working fathers and lonely elderly. But nowadays, when we hear about a wide variety of injustices, we get all worked up and angry and spout off our opinions and our disgust and our resentments and really hateful things without really helping anyone or making any difference. It just makes us feel good to express our concern and intelligence and makes us feel like we've done something, and without actually being inconvenienced or doing anything. Without actually giving of our personal time and money. All these opinions. Like one of my other friends, when I was spouting some hateful thing, he wrote, "How is that supposed to make me feel?" And that has become a motto in my mind. How does that supposed to make me feel? So what does God need to prune off us today? So that we're not so diverted into pointless busyness or petty complaining or uselessly fulfilling our bodily desires. Remember, our paradigm of life is joy. We're here to bring it about. We're here to bring joy. It's so hard to wrap our head around that. We live life to the glory of God because that's why He made us. And the glory of God is joy in the planet Earth. Now, live in that paradigm of life in the vine. It's all about joy. So did you feel your paradigm shift today? I think so. Amen.